Good morning, everyone. Welcome. We will get started in just a moment. Well, welcome again, everyone, to today's webinar. Let's talk about intimate partner violence, family-centered approaches for domestic violence, keeping survivors and children's needs in mind, part 5. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Great Lakes MHTTC and SAMHSA. The Great Lakes ATTC, MHTTC, and PTTC are funded by SAMHSA under the following cooperative agreements. The opinions expressed in this webinar are the views of the speaker and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services and SAMHSA. The MHTTC network believes that words matter and uses affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all activities. For more upcoming events and information, please follow the Great Lakes MHTTC on social media or visit our website. A few housekeeping items. If you're having any technical issues, please individually message me, Jen Winslow, or Alyssa Kuala in the chat section at the bottom of your screen, and we will be happy to assist you. If you have any questions for our speaker, please put them in the Q&A section on your Zoom toolbar rather than the chat, so we can do our best to get those answered. If captions or live transcript would be helpful, please use your Zoom toolbar near the bottom to enable them by going into the More section, select Captions and Show Captions. At the very end of this presentation, you will be automatically redirected to a very brief survey. We appreciate you filling it out. It will just take a quick minute. Certificates of attendance will be sent out via email to all who attended the session in full. This can take up to 2 weeks, and please keep your eye on your junk and spam folders as they sometimes can end up there. The recording and presentation materials will be available within the next week on the Great Lakes MHTTC website. And you will also receive an email following the presentation with a PDF of the slides and the handout. I want to welcome our presenter, Cathy Cave. Cathy has more than 30 years experience as an administrator, facilitator, and consultant specializing in cultural inclusion, equity, anti-racism work and disparities elimination, trauma-informed services and supports, organizational development, supervisory practice and leadership coaching within child welfare, juvenile justice, disaster response, healthcare, mental health, and substance use services. She is one of New York State's early trauma champions, coordinating county collaboratives and clinical training trauma conferences. For the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health, Cathy is engaged in internal and external planning, development, and change initiatives. She provides in-person and virtual training, TA, and curriculum development supporting programs, coalitions, other technical assistance centers, governmental bodies, and community-based organizations. Since 2012, as a senior training consultant with NCDVTMH, she utilizes her survivor, family, community, and administrative perspectives to facilitate organizational change to improve service quality at local, state, and national levels. Thanks for being here, everyone, and welcome, and I'll hand it over to you, Cathy.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. Good morning. I love that I've been able to participate in this series. It's been a really good experience for me in terms of being able to look at all the different things that we talk about at the center and just kind of see them all come to life in this one space. So I just love that I got to be a part of this. And thank you for having me. Today, we're going to be focusing in on family-centered work and how do we hold space for families, excuse me, that are involved in services related to domestic violence or are seeking services because of domestic violence. And that when we talk about being family-centered in this work, we really are focused on, for me, and especially today, and our family, and thinking about the family-centered toolkit, survivors and their children, and the ways that we want to strengthen that relationship. And the way we talk about and frame all of our work at the center is really thinking about intimate partner violence or domestic violence and our advocacy around that. Always having a trauma lens, but trauma isn't the entire conversation. We really need to hold up human rights and social justice, and that there's a cultural context to every person and every community, every family. And so wanting to make sure that we're always holding those things so that it doesn't become, we just focused on the damage that's been done, that people have rich cultural context, they have traditions, values, they have community connections. And if we are only focused on healing the harm, that means we're only first looking at the harms, and we may miss beautiful, enriching things about folks. I think the other piece that's incredibly important for us in our work is that relationship and connection are the center of everything. And I do know that that resonates for many in this audience, that without relationship, we could have amazing tools, but we have no way to deploy them. So in thinking about relationship, we're holding a survivor-defined approach, that we are focused on both physical and emotional safety. And I think that is something that often gets overlooked in the work. And that, of course, holding hope and resilience for folks and with folks at all times, and believing that change is possible, but it's the change that survivors wish to make for themselves. And so, and what I've just described, we talk about it in our work at the center as an integrated approach. It's how are we always holding all of these pieces? And then for the purposes of our conversation today, one of the big pieces is that believing, knowing in our bones, and acting as if we absolutely understand that the person in a relationship who is causing the harm is accountable for the violence. And so I just want to say that up front. And then the other piece that goes with that, related to today's conversation and the work of many of you, is that holding the person causing harm accountable for the violence looks like something very specific. And so when we talk about it in terms of mental health services and supports and treatment, it's making sure that we are never recommending couples counseling when intimate partner violence is in the mix. That is never a recommendation. And there are absolutely available programs for people who use violence in their relationships. And those are battering intervention programs. They have a very specific way of working that holds that accountability, and making sure that if someone in the home is causing harm to someone else, that that person is not able to be in couples counseling, for example, and manipulating both survivors and clinicians who might be intending to do good work. So accountability and battering intervention happens in a very specific way, outside of the scope of what we have time to talk about today, but I did want to say that up front as a framing piece. We're never recommending couples counseling. And if someone who's causing harm is asking for support and assistance, making sure that we know in advance as a good community partner who has battering intervention programs, how do we make referrals to those programs, and how do we help keep accountability and responsibility for the harm where it belongs, and that is with the person who's causing those harms. Excuse me, I apologize. I am just getting over a cold, and sometimes it just comes back with a vengeance. So I will work on that on my end. during our time together. And I wanted to just take a moment too to help us get grounded and centered and connected. So there's a busy, busy day. It's a busy, busy life. So much is happening. And to be able to just take a moment, and if you would, focus on the center of this spiral shell. Just focus on the center of that for just a moment. And breathe in. As you're breathing, and notice if you're holding any tension, if you're holding any worries. When you breathe out, let those go for the moment. You are welcome to pick those things back up. I'm sure you will. But breathe in again, focus on the center. Hold on to this present moment. And relish the possibilities of the day. And again, as you exhale, let that all be free. So during our time together, we are going to be talking about the Family-Centered Toolkit for Domestic Violence Programs. What I appreciate about the toolkit is that it was designed specifically to speak to domestic violence programs. However, there is so much good information within the toolkit that is helpful to our community partners, helpful for folks who are engaging with survivors. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the layout of the toolkit, the resources. I'll show you some examples. We'll talk about how it can be useful and helpful to you in whatever role that you're in. This was completed in 2021, so it's a fairly new document. But we also have a commitment at the center that when we create something, as information evolves, as people use it, as people say to us, this was really straightforward and helpful, I still have questions about this. I want to say, first of all, that we are available at the National Center for any questions about the toolkit. If you're trying something and you have an experience that you want to share about that, we are happy to hear it and take it in. My contact information is at the end of the slides. You are welcome to reach out. And so this is an opportunity today to introduce you to the toolkit, to talk about what's in it, but also know that for technical assistance, our center is always here. And our mission really, in addition to how we think about our integrated approach for holding trauma and social justice and being survivor driven, as we're holding all of that stuff, we also recognize that in different systems, folks have different ways of interacting with survivors, interacting with our material, interacting with each other and with domestic violence programs. So I really want to make sure that you all know and understand we are here for you in whatever is coming up as you experience and experiment with the toolkit. So part of the intention behind this is that we also noticed, as we've been talking about being trauma informed, for a long, long time, that we're holding being culturally responsive. And we have a way of talking about that and thinking about that. As we were listening to each other as a staff and really talking about resources that would be helpful for programs and coalitions, the mental health system folks, substance use support services folks, that we recognize that when we talk about the needs of survivors in relationship to their children and with their children, that we also needed to focus on where being developmentally sensitive fits. And so for me, my initial work early in my career, I was a Head Start teacher, and I also taught in elementary schools. And, always thinking about children and development, but also important in our conversation that we're always holding experiences that children have. At the same time, we're thinking about the supportive parent or survivor who is parenting, and that connection with children. So we know disruptions happen because violence is disruptive. We get that. And so it's both, we're holding, what do we know about violence and the impact on relationships within families, and what does it mean for our services to families? We also always want to support youth within the context of their parenting with the person who is not causing harm. And so part of the challenge gets to be that very often survivors are not thinking about leaving. That's not what they want. They want the violence to stop, but they want to keep their families intact. And we understand that. And again, survivor driven means we will support you to do what you need to do. At the same time, we need to be really clear that services for people causing harm happen separately from those services that are supportive to survivors and reconnecting, staying connected, parenting their children. And so it can be a very tricky dance to hold all of these pieces at once, but we do it with care and kindness and with transparency. You know, this is what we do for the family member who's causing harm. There's an additional program. This is where their services can be. And so figuring all that out and talking about all of that in a way that stays respectful and conveys that respect can be challenging sometimes, because we all, we're human, we have feelings. And so when we talk about being culturally responsive, trauma-informed, and developmentally sensitive in terms of this toolkit, we wanted to make sure that that stays at the heart of things, but also that we talk about what that means in some really concrete ways, and that we offer resources, we have activities that we're offering, things that can be really very practically used by folks working in mental health, substance use, domestic violence advocacy, all of the human resources, wanting to make sure that the messaging is clear and that there's real concrete things that can happen. And so as we talk a little bit and think a little bit about what does it mean and what does it look like? Why us? Why this toolkit? What are we hoping to do? And at the core of all of this is that there's a way that coercive control within the relationships between intimate partners is disruptive to our sense of well-being, but it's also specifically disruptive to survivors' parenting. And these tactics are intentional and they're used to undermine. So I wanted to, I know we've talked a little bit about this in our other webinars in this series, but I really wanted to bring this front and center today, that survivors are really concerned about what's happening for their children, for the welfare of their children, and that people who are using violence to cause harm are very intentional about using tactics that undermine parenting, that undermine survivors' sense of safety and sanity and being able to reach out for support, assistance, and protection. And so when the violence includes coercive control related to children, it escalates that sense of risk. It escalates that sense of how survivors respond. And can they respond in these ways? And what will the cost be, not just to them, but to their children? And if they do respond in a different way, it's always going to come back to what's the cost to me and my children. And so really thinking about the things that come up for folks, and that these deliberate acts to undermine parenting are often not visible to people who want to provide support to families. And so what can happen is that when someone who's causing harm is part of mental health support, part of substance use treatment, part of the conversations with child welfare. What they may be doing is learning new ways to provide that negative leverage, learning new ways to be coercive, learning new ways to be undermining. And sometimes without knowing it, those of us who work in these other systems may be colluding with the abusive partner to cause additional harm. So the tactics are effective, that they are definitely undermining, but also I think the key function they serve is to isolate survivors from sources of help and support. And so we have to be aware that, oh, wait, my spidey sense is tingling. Maybe there's domestic violence or intimate partner violence as a part of what's happening. And as a provider, I need to be aware, to notice, to pay attention, and then make sure that there are ways, that there are times that we're talking specifically with survivors alone so that we can check in on what else might be happening at home. Is there violence at home? Are you safe at home? And being able to ask those kinds of questions without the partner present. And that can be tricky and that can be hard to do, especially if someone who appears to be a very concerned partner wants to be a part of all your conversations. That may give you pause to think about, oh, this is a supportive person, and maybe I need to check in alone with this other partner to see if this is indeed okay. Are they truly safe at home? Let me understand what's happening. And so important to know that the tactics can include all kinds of things. Reproductive control is very common. Threats related to, I'm going to call child welfare, and threats of custody and losing custody, threats of, especially for undocumented folks, deportation, undermining their every sense of safety that they might possibly have, and a threat to, just being able to care for your kids and be involved in their lives. And so all of this serves to undermine parenting when there are children in the mix. So including, taking advantage of heterosexism and homophobia and transphobia as an example of another way of undermining folks because of identity. And so when everybody finds out who you are and how you are, you're going to lose everything is a very common threat. And then this all works because stigma exists in the first place, especially around mental health challenges and especially around substance use. And so as we think about how in this series, we've talked about some very specific areas, and we've talked about mental health, we've talked about substance use, we've talked about these pieces. Where this all comes together, kind of collides, is when there are children in the mix and the abusive tactics are undermining parenting. And so that's the focus of our conversation today. All right. And so we've talked about some of this, in terms of coercion related to mental health and substance use, but it's that constant undermining. If you can step back from it and think about, if I see each person as whole, and I can consider all the aspects of their lives, when an abusive partner is engaged in undermining sanity, sobriety, credibility, and parenting, what they're doing is like they're stepping back and looking at every opportunity to undermine the whole person that you see. So if your heart says, I'm here for this, I'm here to recognize that this is a whole person and these are all the aspects of their lives, keep in mind that there may be an abusive partner who's undermining every aspect of this person that you notice. So from controlling meds to controlling whether or not a survivor gets to leave the house to go to a support group, to sabotaging recovery. Oh, you don't need that medication. It's going to make you sick. It makes you woozy. Or a survivor may notice that, oh, wait, I can't be aware. I can't stay as aware as I need to be. I can't be as protective of my kids as I need to be. if I'm taking this medication because it makes me nauseous or drowsy or whatever it does. And so these are really common concerns for survivors who are experiencing intimate partner violence and also trying to navigate mental health treatment. And that, again, this piece of an abusive partner getting close to that treatment experience, being involved in that treatment experience, and often convincing authorities, oh yeah, they were just out of control. Yeah, I had to do something. No, without me, that person would never get to their appointments. I always have to make sure they go. And so they end up looking really good. They end up looking very well put together. They may actually appear to be in much better shape than survivors and the more effective parent than the survivor. But that's by design, because they are making themselves look to be, important and essential and center to treatment in all interactions. They are also undermining the partner's ability to recover and heal. So when we're not aware, we may unintentionally collude and put survivors at greater risk. So that's our why. And I wanted to, just open up the conversation and see if folks would have questions or want to put some information in the chat. But what barriers or challenges have you found in developing a family-centered approach to programs and services? So our why is that so much is stacked against survivors as they are trying to heal and recover and parent, and that keeping the family in mind as survivors wish, that's what we want to do. But it does mean for us that we have to recognize all of the undermining, recognize all of the tactics, and think about, and even in light of all of that, a survivor may want to stay connected or may need to stay connected or may recognize that they're greater risk if their abusive partner doesn't see the kids or isn't engaged in that, or they can't leave because they will be more unsafe after they attempt to go. So all of that's in the mix. And so that's our why for being family-centered. It's following what survivors want because they know best what their family situation is. They may not know exactly what to do at every moment in response, but they know that experience better than anyone else ever could. And so being family-centered means holding survivors in mind at the center of all things, particularly as it relates to kids. And so I wonder, in your work, thinking about families and sustaining a family-centered approach, have you noticed any barriers or challenges that have come up for you, just in the way that you approach your work?
Cathy, somebody in the chat said poorly trained, overworked CPS staff.
Yes, yes, and yes. Thank you so much for that. And we recently worked on a curriculum for child welfare practitioners, like working with staff who work in the child welfare system, really around understanding intimate partner violence and really thinking about accountability and responsibility and supporting survivors to maintain connection with their children. And that, historically, we've had this challenge around survivors being blamed for failure to protect. That's been, a long-standing issue. We've done training with not just us, but folks in the movement, the broader domestic violence movement, have done lots of training and had lots of conversations with everyone from family court judges to guardian ad litems to child welfare staff. And the challenges are, as you say, they're holding so much. They're often not given the training that they need or don't have access to the training that they need to really hold all of this in mind. And that there are laws and policies and practices that are counter to family-centered work. And so there's a lot to work on in that system for sure. Thanks for bringing it up.
We also had a couple more on of those barriers are unavailable emergency services,
Mhm.
shelters for victims with children of domestic violence. And another one is lack of local resources in certain areas and miseducation about DV cycle.
Yeah, all true, all true. And that, so much happens in terms of the dynamics of intimate partner violence, right? What we know is that, there can be one incident or there can be 1,000, and that no matter what that looks like or how it's showing up, because it could be physical, it could be emotional, it could be financial, it could be spiritual. Again, ways of undermining a whole person in a very intentional way that does so much harm. It can get in the way of us seeing families as, wait, there is something positive here, that there is something in the connection between survivors and kids that we can strengthen and support. And so because we either don't know, or there's a lack of opportunities, a lack of resources, it is very challenging in many, many places and many communities for survivors with children to find access to shelter. I mean, that is, it's one of our major challenges. And so depending on the age of the children, depending on available resources, during the pandemic, there was both an increase in intimate partner violence and a decrease in available resources. And so we've experienced all of that, and it's very challenging for sure. Any other thoughts or comments related to any of that around barriers?
Around barriers, there was a couple more comments. Judges not being aware of IPV issues, capacity. Our DV shelter for women and children had to turn away more than 80% of requests for shelter this year due to not having openings. There's so little affordable housing available that folks are staying in shelter for long periods of time. And one more regarding the judges not being aware. It says, for example, judges recommending mediation in a divorce case where IPV is involved.
Yeah, yep, all of it. Thank you for all of that, right? So in addition to never recommending couple counseling, we also never recommend mediation. And so the we in this case, is the field at large. So we've long understood that mediation is not effective and puts survivors at greater risk, because mediation assumes a balance of power. And that is exactly what's not present in domestic violence. And so when we think about the absolute no's are couple counseling and mediation for sure. And it's then how do we, again, hold all these pieces? And I love the facts that you're sharing around, having to turn away 80%. I don't love that that's happening, but I love the clarity about it. And I think we need to keep, sounding the alarm around that, is that there are not enough services. There's not enough shelter beds. There's not enough housing. And so what we know is some communities are engaged in terms of domestic violence programs, actually getting more involved and invested in transitional housing, and that those programs are great, but also limited. So when we have a lack of housing, we have a pandemic, we have an increase in isolation also during the pandemic. And so I think that is directly related to how domestic violence is escalating, how reports are escalating, and how there's a lack of everything that we need, right? In terms of providing the resources and support that survivors can benefit from, and that all families can benefit from. And so we need this array of services that in many, many communities does not exist. And so it makes sense that mental health providers might be the first to notice that there's something happening within an intimate relationship, that there's violence present, that something doesn't feel quite right. And so paying attention to our intuition and wondering about how folks are doing, that is all part of our why, right? Because we care, we deeply care. Any
Cathy,
other? Yeah, go ahead.
sorry, we did have another question in there that isn't part of the barrier question, but somebody asked, are there any physical or verbal cues we can pick up on when dealing with IPV?
So, good question. And what I would say is that, you all work a lot with folks who have experienced trauma and will, have trauma responses. And what we know from that work is that no one's responses are the same as anyone else's. And so paying attention to our, that gut sense that I wonder. So it's more paying attention to your sense of curiosity. Like, I wonder if this person is safe at home, and then make sure that you ask the question, and don't ask just once. If you're wondering, what's up, feels like someone's hiding something. It feels that they're holding back. It feels that, they are not being forthcoming. It could be that they just don't trust you yet to share anything. Or it could be that they don't feel safe telling you that they're experiencing violence at home. So you can ask directly. Don't hold back, but you want to make sure that when you ask directly, you're asking when the person is one-on-one with you. And it's simply, are you safe in your home? Is anyone harming you at home? So while there might be cues, we don't know what cues could be related to what. So we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know. So the key for us, and the way we talk about all of this, is when you form relationship, you have access to two things. You have access to your skills and talents that you can use in the space between you and the person, and that you can convey that caring. You also have access to creating relationship where survivors begin to trust you as a human being. And so it's in those relationships where we have both trust and our skills and knowledge that we can begin to ask real questions around, are you safe? And so there are questions that you can ask, and I'm sure that in previous webinars we've talked about, there's the toolkit on mental health and substance use coercion has great questions that you as a provider can ask when you think that there could be an experience of intimate partner violence with survivor that you're talking with the person that you're talking with. And so because we can't predict, we don't have a crystal ball, we don't know what's going on for that person, it's asking everyone, are you safe at home? And so again, how you do it matters, when you do it matters, and making sure that it's you're asking when the person is alone. And being also clear that if someone says, yes, I'm safe at home, you might want to check in about that at another time as well. You can continue to ask. And if someone says, no, I'm not safe at home, there are some follow-up questions that are offered in that particular toolkit that you can follow up with around asking about coercion related to mental health. Is there someone, for example, who's trying to control your medication or tells you not to take your medication or prevents you from going to support groups, prevents you from going to appointments? So there are all kinds of ways to ask and that we can't guess. So if your spidey sense is tingling, it's always good to pay attention to your intuition. I think that's great, but use it to ask the questions. Don't use it to assume that you know. Work on relationship, work on connection. And as you build trust, people may start to tell you things. It is also really common for survivors to share something that for them is a smaller detail or a less painful incident, to see how you react. If you react in a supportive way, that helps to build trust, and you may get more information later on. But always asking, about resources. I have, a relationship with a local domestic violence program. If you ever need that kind of a resource, please let me know. We can make that connection. Letting folks know in proactive ways and in affirming ways that you're here for this conversation, not just, oh, I asked once and we're done with it. So I hope that helps. Any other thoughts or comments before we move on?
There's one last question here about judges again. How do we create awareness in judges that emotional abuse is part of IPV?
Cool. There is an amazing organization. It's called the Battered Women's Justice Project. And what they do is really help with training and language and information directed towards judges and attorneys. And so reaching out to them to check in on resources is really helpful. At the National Center, we have on our website, we have a page devoted to trauma-informed legal advocacy. And there are scenarios there for using to talk about with legal advocates, with judges, with attorneys. So there's a few resources out there, but I would definitely offer the Battered Women's Justice Project, as they are specifically focused on the legal system and how to convey messaging around trauma. And so reach out to our center or reach out to that center, and definitely look for documentation, tip sheets, an article, a story that describes exactly what intimate partner violence looks like, and that it encompasses all of these things. We are actively educating people all the time around coercion related to mental health challenges and substance use, and really trying to talk through and talk about the ways that that shows up, because lots of folks just don't understand it and they don't make the connection. So these are constant conversations for us. And so we're always looking for resources and always thinking about that conversation in particular, because so much of the family-centered work can hinge upon how a judge views all of this. And often judges don't see it, don't understand it, and will undermine further that relationship between survivors and their children, or recommend mediation, or right, there's all kinds of conditions. And so every state is different in terms of what some of that looks like, but the themes are really similar in terms of making sure that our legal folks understand how abusive partners undermine parenting, that it makes sense that when someone has been abused, those responses can show up in all of these ways. And so I've seen lots of folks who work in mental health and substance use trying to support survivors, and with really conveying the absolute, it's dismantling, it's emotionally abusive as well as it is physically or financially abusive. Like, all of these pieces matter. And this survivor here is doing everything that they can do to survive, to maintain connection and parent their children. And so even in our advocacy, it's constantly coming back to conversations that we're thinking like, wait, I still have to talk about this. And yes, we do. We absolutely do have to keep coming back to these conversations. So when we are talking about family-centered work and supporting survivors in their parenting, understanding the legacy of abuse and trauma, and how that's impacting everyone, and keeping accountability where it belongs. It involves changing the ways that our organizations support families, support survivors who experience domestic violence, and what are they willing to do in terms of really looking inward. What are you willing to do? To question, to interrogate, how are we as an organization continuing to support survivors parenting, do this family-centered approach that requires a lot of listening, requires a lot of understanding, requires a great deal of patience and flexibility are probably the words that come most to mind, right? Are we willing to look at all of that and to say, yeah, these are ways we could be better at family-centered work. These are the things we could do to improve our approach to family-centered work. And what else do we need to learn? And so with that in mind is kind of at the core of the toolkit. What are we willing to look at? What are we willing to think about together? And then what's in this toolkit that would be helpful? And so I wanted to share that the toolkit has some examples, there are scenarios, there are lots of resources. I'll talk more in just a minute about all the pieces that are in the toolkit. But I wanted to pull out part of a scenario for us to hold in mind in case there are folks who are part of our conversation today who may not have had direct experience with survivors who are struggling and living with their experiences of domestic violence. And so I pulled this example out to share. While completing the intake documents in whatever program we might be in, Sue, who's a brand new client, shares with you her history of physical and emotional abuse that her daughter, Janie, who's age 7, witnessed. Janie has unsupervised visitation with her father, who is Sue's abusive partner, 2 weekends a month. Sue also shares that Janie tells Sue that she's scared of her father, but hasn't said anything more specific. So this kind of conversation is very common to occur where there's a piece, we don't have all of the story, we don't have all of the information, but there's enough to make our spidey sense tingle or the hair on our arms raise up a little bit. And so for thinking about, what is happening within any family unit. And again, no two families are alike, but there are themes that do repeat, that do show up, that we experience a lot. And so thinking about if this kind of situation came up, would we have the resources and what would we do? And so what's in the toolkit that can help with this sort of stuff? What will be helpful? What is it that might move us all forward in thinking about family-centered work in a more inclusive way? So trauma-informed and family-centered work. When we are thinking about things from a trauma-informed perspective, and that includes for me being culturally responsive, includes being aware of the activism that families might need, the advocacy families might need, that the trauma that some folks are experiencing is not just trauma from the present, but there's individual experience that may be outside of intimate partner violence. There's collective and historical traumatic experiences. When we think about sources of trauma related to genocide, related to enslavement, related to the annihilation of whole groups of people. So we have to, we're holding all of these pieces because, when we are being trauma informed, it's not just the intrapersonal dynamics that happen. It's not just the interpersonal dynamics that happen, that there's stuff that is coming up in terms of trauma responses and the way that people cope and the way that people heal that may be related to all different aspects of people's lives. And so while many of us may be thinking about ACEs and adverse childhood experiences, there's much more to someone's traumatic experience than just that one look at ACEs. And we look at environment, we look at culture and history, and we look at all of the ways that people are impacted in terms of family and community. So then we have to add this layer of family-centered, and that our practices embrace the whole family as defined by each individual survivor and their family for themselves. So when a survivor says, my family is my ex-partner, my family is my current partner, and this is what's happening in my home. So any of that is we need to work with how survivors decide for themselves, define for themselves, and then think about what actions can we take and what do we do to support the caregiver-child relationship and other family relationships. And then even with all that said, if survivors are saying, my partner is abusive to me and is part of my family, will continue to be part of my family, it's not up to me to say, well, that's terrible, or I wish you would do something different. What my role is to think about things like safety planning, things like support, that support to you, this is what we can do in this space. If your partner is choosing to end the violence, I have a referral to another place for services and support. So it's that flexibility that we can hold everybody together in our mind as a family, in our hearts as a family, but also saying we need to think about other ways to find supports that we can put in place. You can't be the person, or you may not be the person who supplies all of those things to an entire family. That it may be these are things we do, and then these are things that our partners can do. So best thing, if you're in the mental health space, or if you are someone who works in substance use space, that the best thing we can do in those spaces is make sure that we're partnering with domestic violence programs in a proactive way. And to do that on a local basis, and to do that with intention. So then when someone discloses, you have things that you can do, but you're also offering supports from experts whose work this is. And then the cultural piece is, even as we continue to do all of those things, is that understanding that culture is central to people's lives. And what are we going to do about that? How can we address that? What supports do you have in your community? Who supports you? And then making sure that whatever we do, we're promoting access, we're doing it in ways that feel equitable, and we're also offering this respect that is central to forming relationships. Excuse me. Just want to check in if there are any other comments or questions.
We don't at the moment, but I just want to remind folks that we do have that Q&A section on your Zoom toolbar. So if you do have a question, please put it there. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. All right, so part of what this means and may mean for you and your work is that we may be challenging some core beliefs in the way that we think about families, and to do family-centered work with this lens for understanding domestic violence. And so sometimes folks question, can people who experience and survive domestic violence be good parents? And the response to that is yes, of course. But it does mean checking our assumptions and our beliefs and our biases that could prevent us from seeing survivors as whole people, that could see survivors as effective parents. And so especially if we've had these experiences ourselves in our own life, we may have beliefs about what good parenting looks like. And so this too is a challenge in child welfare. It's a challenge for judges. It's a challenge for us because we're humans, to really think about what are the biases that are in place, and we can check them. So there's information that helps us to do that in the toolkit. Can survivors who use substances be good caregivers for their children? And the answer to that is also yes. But what supports need to be in place for child safety, for survivor safety? Again, there's coercion, and then there's what's happening underneath and the ways that people are coping. And it makes sense that there would be a high correlation between substance use and intimate partner violence. And so we know that, y'all have talked about that in previous conversations in this series. And so it's really believing that survivors who have substance use concerns and mental health concerns can be good caregivers. And if we start from that place, rather than absolutely no, they can't, we start from yes, and what are the supports that are needed and how can I be helpful? Then that gives us some room to create space for a belief in families, a belief in survivors, and that with the right supports, with the kinds of directness and honesty around what are the concerns and what are the issues, but doing it from a place of, again, if there's any blame for the violence, it's keeping that responsibility and accountability with the abusive partners, and then talk with survivors about how do I support your healing and recovery, and expressing a desire or a belief that if survivors want to stay in relationship with their children in good ways, that we would love to support them for that to happen. And here's what that work might look like, and lay that out for folks. The structure of the toolkit itself, I just want to pause here for a moment and share. So there's an introduction that kind of provides this overview of why are we here and how are we here. There's readiness and getting started for this kind of change or this kind of commitment. And if you're already doing a lot, and many of you are already doing a lot to work with survivors in positive ways and be family-centered, there are some just resources within the toolkit that help you check how ready are we. And we have this commitment, we have this belief, but do we have the infrastructure? Do we have ways of talking about it? Do we have the tools and resources we need to be truly family-centered? Do we have the domestic violence partnerships? And so there's opportunity to question and to wonder about what you have in place in your agency. Do we have a team of folks who want to take a look at this? I will say the toolkit is quite large, so there's a lot of stuff that's in it. Everything from creating a welcoming environment that's family friendly, that is actually survivor friendly, is really important. So often in our waiting rooms, so I've worked many years in mental health, I've worked in child welfare, I've run a mental health funded foster care program. So I've just seen all of this from so many perspectives that sometimes the spaces where we're asking folks to even to meet us, to wait for us, to show up, to connect with us, are spaces that put survivors at risk, or where they feel they're too exposed and open and at risk. So even in our waiting rooms, is there another way to look at that? Is there a space that even someone who is just arriving can wait in a space, separate space with their kids while they're waiting for an appointment or something can happen? So it's really looking at, what's our lens for what is family friendly, and how are we making that look? How are we making our spaces? And then when we look at programs and services, what do we do for children? What do we do for teens? And for family-centered practice, how are we viewing children within the context of their parenting, especially when domestic violence is part of the conversation, because it may be different than what we're used to doing. And then consistent messaging around attachment, trauma, healing, and family-centered services. And so how do we bring all of that knowledge about attachment and child development into what we do? And so again, many of you already do a lot of that work in your mental health practices, particularly if you're children's therapists, right? But what's so important with domestic violence is holding the child's needs and the parent's needs in mind at the same time. And that may be new to the approach that you use. Other aspects of the toolkit include responding to substance use and mental health challenges, inclusive services for families, thinking about culture, thinking about connection and community, and how do we work together, supporting parents in a general way in their caregiving, for supporting parents who are affected by domestic violence. So lots of information, and the way the toolkit is laid out with around mental health, substance use, there, and then a section on activities that you can do for supporting people to learn more and do more, but also activities that you can actually do with families. So there's activities that will help folks in your team, in your programs, understand more, experience more, activities to test out together as a group or staff, and then to really look at, here are some very specific things that I can do during the time I spend with survivors and their children to support the work that they're doing to maintain connection. And then lots of tools and resources, and also information about how to evaluate the work that you're doing. So if you're changing something and you want to try the family-centered work, some strategies for evaluating what you're doing so that you can look back and say, yeah, we made this shift, or we incorporated this practice, and this is helpful, and this is how I know it's helpful. Excuse me. The layout within each of the sections offers some guidance. So this is how you do it kind of a conversation. There's resources, and there are a lot of resources. And so, and it's all in one place. So if you wanted to focus on what can we do to make our physical environment more family friendly when we consider this lens of domestic violence, you can just go to that section. You don't have to read the entire toolkit. You can go to that section and you can take a look, and there'll be some guidance, there'll be some resources. And then there's some kind of discussion opportunities. So there's lots of scenarios. And then following each scenario is, what can I do? What can we consider? What do I need to think about before I act? And the additional questions include that if I work in direct services, what can I do? If I'm a supervisor, what's my nickel in this quarter, is what my friend Michael likes to say, right? It's like, how do we have a comprehensive look and not just say, yeah, go out, do family-centered services, but be more supportive to folks who have that drive, that desire, that commitment. Yes, I want to do family-centered services. The toolkit is here to say, all right, let me support you on how to do that. Let us support you in how. So the resources are wide ranging. There are resources that might be specific to clinicians, that, here's some clinical guidance around this piece, or here is an article on a specific kind of intervention, or here's a book that talks about or talks more about creating physical space. Here's an article that gives you a deeper understanding to support survivors of intimate partner violence. And so if I were looking, I just want to go back for one moment to this layout. If I was looking for more information about directly supporting parents and caregivers, because this is new in my understanding, I could just go to section 9 and look at that. And then when I go to section 9, I'm going to find guidance, that here's some things to think about. The guidance is clear and it's direct. So we start in this philosophical place and then get very, very specific around, okay, so you want to do this work? Here are some very specific things that can help you with your practice. And then some questions and some scenarios to work with. What I love about the scenarios and the way that each section is laid out is that Here's an example, and let's pull this apart. And you can do that on your own, or you could do it at a staff meeting with a group of folks. You could spend time yourself looking through and, what's good for me, or we could spend it as an organization, what's good for us. So included in all of this, as I was saying, there's best practices for offering family-focused or family-centered services. There's topic-specific exploration. So again, you could go to, I have a survivor that I'm working with whose partner is possibly preventing them from practicing some of the tools that we've talked about. Some for engaging in a peer support group, for example, or preventing them from leaving the house. What are some things that I might want to look at? I might want to look at how do I support survivors? I might want to look at the section on mental health coercion. I may want to think about ways that I can communicate with the survivor to arrange for times that we can meet without the abusive partner knowing that. We might want to strategize about that. I may want to have, if I'm a supervisor, I may want to think about how do I use this information as part of our new staff orientation? How do I use this at a staff meeting to focus on a challenge that came up with one of the families that our organization is involved with last week? And so there's this flexibility to approach things in this very practical way. And then there's also this way of looking at it as there's information here that will help us be proactive in and help in our own growth and development as an organization. And there's resources for that. When we are actively thinking about and working with survivors, excuse me, there are times that in your work, no matter what work we do, if you're working with human beings, that we need spaces to have real talk about how we're doing, about how our interactions are, about what are the ways that we're working with families. Do we feel clear and direct? And do we feel like we have a way that we want to proceed? And so many of you in your clinical practice may be used to having reflective conversations. One of the things that we have done in our organization is to talk about reflection as a key component of supervision for anyone. If you're working with human beings, being able to have reflective conversations where we talk about what's coming up in the work, how we think or feel about what happened in an interaction with a family, with an individual, what's something that's come up that was new for us that we haven't dealt with before, and using our supervisory process to talk about these events, check our perspectives and give feedback, and then to leave that in conversation with a clearer plan about how we want to move forward. And so our center has a tip sheet on this that we can make sure is available. It's an introduction to reflective practice for those of you that this may be new for, but it's also part of everything we talk about related to understanding intimate partner violence and the impact of trauma on those of us who are doing the work, whether we have our own trauma experiences or it's secondary trauma and we're having a reaction to someone else's experience and pain. So we talk about reflection in the toolkit. We also, again, have other additional resources that support that process. So one of the other things that I mentioned is in the toolkit are activities. So there's activities for teams and for families. And then there's opportunities for staff to self-reflect. And so we've talked about reflection, in a hot second here, but it's an essential part of moving forward productively in our work. And I've seen reflection and introduction of that process when it's introduced as part of the supervisory structure or plan or the way we do things, absolutely change how it feels to work in an environment in terms of people feeling that it's okay to be vulnerable and to talk in supervision and with your colleagues about what your struggles might be. And so I'm going to talk first about the activities for staff reflection, where we check in about willingness. We're checking in about comfort. How are you doing in your work with families? The reason this toolkit even is one of a big part of the reason why this toolkit is even was created is because what we found is in our work with domestic violence programs and coalitions that the three things that staff struggle with the most are when survivors have mental health challenges, when survivors have substance use challenges, and when survivors are parenting. And that it's a space where even when folks are so open and involved in the movement to end domestic violence, where they struggle is around the interactions between survivors and kids. And so it might not feel how I believe parenting should be, or they may struggle with people need to watch their kids, but then if somebody's deep in a trauma response, can they watch their kids right now, today? Or do they need support to do that today? Did something come up that activated someone's fear response? So as a survivor myself, a trauma survivor myself, one of the things that was challenging for me is when my daughter was 2 years old, I started having flashbacks. So I'm really good at my job. I love my job. I was working in housing at the time, but I was unable to work and unable to effectively parent in that moment. And so fortunately, was surrounded by a community of colleagues and friends who supported me in both those roles. Know how absolutely important parenting is to me, was able to come to my house and ask me things in the morning like, what do you want your kids to wear today? What do you want to happen for lunch? What's happening in terms of school bus pickup and getting them after school, all of those things. And it didn't last for a very long time, but there was an absolute support for my parenting. There was absolute support for me to do my work. And so the ways that we show up for each other matters a great deal. And so if my friends and colleagues had treated me and judged me, oh, you can't parent, then we need to make sure we remove your kids from this home. And that judgment would have been based on what? That I can't pick out their clothing right now because I'm having flashbacks about clothing I was wearing when I was 2, right? Like these are the things we have to keep in mind about knowing how trauma works. And so when this stuff comes up for us, as individuals, as people who do this work, as people who are passionate about the work we do, we need to incorporate reflection, and here's activities in this toolkit that help to do that. When we're talking about activities for teams to do, activities to do with families, some of the team stuff is really around visioning. How do we think about our values? How do we create services or maybe refine services? And here's all these scenarios. Here's an opportunity to use them. But also, how do we navigate what's coming up for us in terms of thoughts and feelings as we respond to these scenarios? And then for sharing with families, we want to encourage co-regulation. We want to keep survivors in the parent role and supporting them to calm and soothe and care for their kids. So in the example I gave you from my life, it's not so much that it mattered what color clothing my kids were wearing today. What mattered was me being seen as the parent that makes those decisions and supported to be the parent who makes those decisions. And if my kids are upset, do I have the resources and the skills and the capacity right now to soothe them? So the activities for sharing with families support that. And also talk about navigating children's behavior. Sometimes kids behave in ways that, for any of you who parent, you get this. You have a picture in your mind of your worst tantrum day with children, right? Children are not always easy to navigate with, and they have their own responses and their own challenges, especially when they've experienced or witnessed domestic violence in some way. And so when those experiences are contributing to challenging behaviors, we need to talk about that. It becomes part of the work that we do. And so there's plenty of activities and ideas and thoughts about how do we connect to what children are experiencing and how do we help navigate that in behavioral ways. Some ways that we've thought about in this, things we think about in this, are to really prepare staff. So in your environment where you work, preparing you that when people have experienced intimate partner violence, domestic violence, have been harmed in these ways, that they have thoughts and feelings about that, and so do we. So instead of having that eke out in some sideways fashion when you're in conversation with survivors or with a family, let's talk about that ahead of time. Let's talk about what's coming up for me. What's my nickel in this quarter? Let's create an environment, and we think about not just the physical space, but the sensory environment. Like, what are the sounds and sights and smells of where we work and how we work? Let's talk about that. There are times when the sensory environment makes all the difference between how survivors are responding in this moment and how children are behaving. And so it's important to look at that in terms of family-centered work. And then to expect that there are differences in confidentiality in those expectations. So I worked in the administration of our state's mental health system for 7 years. And so I certainly understand confidentiality. We had 20 some odd hospitals and 26 licensed program, 2,600 or 2,500 licensed programs. So many programs for us to work with and think about. And so confidentiality is key for all of that. And we have rules and we have HIPAA, we've got all that stuff. But sometimes when we partner with domestic violence programs, we want to somehow, we want the information, we want to know, is this a fact? And what I would say to you is the person that you need to talk with directly is survivors that are partnering with domestic violence programs is for referral. We should not be expecting programs to tell us whether or not survivors have shown up for appointments, whether or not there are notes that we can have, whether or not we can tell, for example, a domestic violence program would have very little information to share with child welfare. So even with survivors' permission, which it would be absolutely necessary to share anything at all, that what advocates would share would be limited. And so the best way would be, again, having those partnerships so you understand, making sure you're educated, making sure that you have information, making sure you have access to where you could partner by giving a survivor a warm referral to a program. So you have a relationship, you've called the program, you've talked to Cathy to say, hey, I'm meeting with a survivor this afternoon. I'm going to ask them about the violence that they've mentioned in the past, and they may be ready for making, for a referral. And I just want to check that, can I give the number and have them call you? Or while we're here together, can we call you? So it's thinking of maybe how to be more engaged in the supportive process, but not expecting that advocates are going to tell you everything. They have their own rules around confidentiality. And so being able to partner under those circumstances, being able to be clear about referral and connection, and what does that look like after you've made the referral? How do we want us to communicate? Making sure that, again, if there's anything we're doing it with survivors and not to them or for them. that it's with them whenever possible. And then always, like, I know it's hard to actually be in a position where we're keeping survivors' needs in mind at the same time as we do children's, is really can be very challenging. But that is the goal. It's in domestic violence programs, one of the things we've worked really hard to do is to actually make sure that survivors are directing what are the resources and supports they want made available to their kids. And so we're talking about it, we're sharing information, but it's not a you must do, it's a here's an offering. And then, of course, reflecting on development and attachment. So we've talked about most of these things, so I won't dwell on that here. But except for this last item of really making sure that we are asking survivors for feedback directly and that we're incorporating what we learn. So when we say to survivors, we want you to try these things, or I'm going to try these things, or this is the way that we're going to move forward and approach this, that we want to make sure we ask them, how was that for you? What did you think about that? Could we have done something different? Could we have done something that would have been more helpful? And that becomes a regular practice. And so one of the ways we talk about that is, have I been helpful today? Is there anything I could have done that would have been more helpful today? And to have that check in every time we meet. So as we think about that scenario that we were talking about with Sue and Janie, and how we think about them and how we move forward with the conversation, the place to go would be to look at section 5, where we're talking about child and family centered practices, programming, services. And again, I would want to look at this proactively. I would want to look at our intake process to make sure that we're being as respectful and caring as we possibly could be, that we have looked at and talked about what's coming up for mom, that we're looking at what's coming up for this child and thinking about safety planning as part of that. But I also need to make sure that as a practitioner, I know what safety planning is. So there are some safety planning resources in this section, but also I would want to make that referral, because we want to make sure that we're asking about substance use. We want to make sure we're asking about any coercion related to mental health. We want to ask about what it is that experience of abuse, what the impact of that has been, and how does that show up. And we want to make sure that we're following the parent's lead and making sure that everything we do is in accordance with what they want. And so the information in the toolkit will help us do that. It helps define these are some options, and that we have different expectations, and that we're going to be making referrals and having partnerships. And in this partnership, I'm going to work on these things around supporting Sue's autonomy, around supporting the mom to be clear about what decisions are in front of her that she might need to make. And then I will support in any way that I can the interaction and the process between this mom and any other community resources that we connect them to. So it's really looking at, it's not my job or to do everything, but what is my role? How can I be a good support to this family system? And what kinds of resources do I need to keep in mind? I would also want to be looking at the section on attachment and child development. What I do want to say about that is that, and this may be familiar to you all, the circle of security is very much embedded into the developmental section of this toolkit. And so while we don't have an opportunity to fully explore this, but it's the attachment piece of seeing a parent as a safe haven and a secure base so that we can support them to remain in that position. And so what that might look like as children go and explore and kids are struggling with momentary hurts and ouches. And then also that more longer term that may look very different, or they in terms of their response to hurt and pain if the children too have been abused in this situation. And so it's a lot to take in and a lot to hold on to. But circle of security and attachment theory are very much embedded in the ways that we talk about working with kids and supporting the parenting. And then section 7 might also be helpful in thinking about and responding to mental health concerns. Again, depending on what's happening for mom, what's coming up, best practices, and really exploring those concerns and what's coming up. Being able to understand that domestic violence is real. It is in the mix in this situation. I'm going to follow Sue's, not just follow her lead, I'm going to believe in what she's telling me about what she's experiencing. And I'm going to make sure that I don't do anything undermining in that process. So working to identify the mental health concerns always, but also wondering that if I'm a mental health practitioner and I'm the person who is kind of central to Sue's just talking to me about this, I don't know that Sue has had any interaction with an advocate from a domestic violence program. I'm going to offer that as one early idea because they're the experts on this. If I'm working domestic violence and Sue is saying, I have a therapist, I've been working on this with my therapist, or I would like to have some support around the mental health concerns. You want that partnership to be in place so that the domestic violence program can call you up and say, hey, Cathy, we have a survivor here in shelter and they are asking for mental health supports. We don't happen to have anything in-house. Is there anything that you all can do? But it's gathering the lay of the land to make sure that we can show up to support this family and respond to their needs and concerns. Again, the caution I have around all of this, around family-centered approaches, is really to make sure that we're not saying, okay, I, individual person, am going to only work with this child, and I'm going to work with this child separately from anything that's happening with their parents. That kind of dynamic actually further minimizes and isolates the parent who's a survivor and dealing with all this stuff. So we need to work in partnership. We need our systems to work in partnership, but also as individuals, we need to work in partnership. What we're hoping to do to support survivor healing is first create a sense of physical and emotional safety. We want to focus on the attachment relationship. So SAS is a piece that is a fundamental strategy within this toolkit. We want to support children to self-regulate, but we also want to support parents to self-regulate. And then we want to help them to co-regulate. So engaging Sue to work on calming, soothing techniques with her child. And all of that is to also, we want to raise self-esteem. We want to support Sue as a whole person so that Sue can be engaged in the healing in a collaborative way on behalf of their child. So we talked a little while ago about reflection and really thinking about SAS in practice. And so it's really for you all, each of you, as we wrap up today, to think about a family that you served, think about their strengths and what they value. How do you and your program support SAS for them? How do you support raising self-esteem for both Sue as an individual and Sue as a caregiving parent, and using this strategy as a way to support healing for the entire family? So again, the toolkit is here. We want to support co-regulation and moving forward together. And then as a last thing, to think about mind-body techniques. So many of you have been exposed to tapping or deep breathing, mind-body healing practices. It's just an example of one of the things that we offer in the toolkit to support that healing. Encouraging creativity, encouraging families to use the arts, and then to think about, where do we go from here? Where do you go from here in terms of reflecting, planning, preparing, implementing, and then evaluating for more reflection? Some of the additional resources that I've mentioned today. And my contact information. So thank you all for your care and your kindness and for attending this webinar.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Cathy, and thank you everyone for being here. Again, you will receive an email following the presentation with the handout and slides. You will all be automatically redirected to a very short survey. This survey enables us to continue to provide free trainings to you all. So we greatly appreciate you taking just a quick moment to fill it out. And again, you will be automatically redirected. Thanks so much, and we hope to see you at a training soon. Bye-bye.